Ryan and Taehyung walked hand in hand along the beach, the sand warm beneath their feet and the sound of the waves crashing against the shore filling the air. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the water and painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. As they strolled along the shoreline, Taehyung couldn't help but steal glances at Ryan, his heart swelling with affection. She looked so beautiful in the soft light of the sun setting, her hair catching the breeze and her eyes sparkling with happiness. Ryan felt Taehyung's gaze on her and turned to him, a smile tugging at her lips. What are you looking at? She teased, her voice light and playful. Taehyung grinned, his eyes crinkling at the corner. Just admiring the view, he replied. His tone filled with warmth. You look even more stunning in this light, if that's even possible. Ryan felt her cheeks flush at his words. She couldn't help but return his smile. She said, nudging him gently with her shoulder. They continued to walk along the beach, their laughter mingling with the sound of the waves. Eventually, they reached their favorite spot, a secluded stretch of land where they sat. Taehyung spread out a blanket and they settled down side by side, their shoulders brushing as they gazed out at the horizon. The sky was ablaze with color, the sun sinking lower and lower until it disappeared below the water, casting a rosy glow over everything around them. One sighed contentedly, leaning against Taehyung's side as they watched the last rays of sunlight fade away. I love moments like this, she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. Just being here with you watching the sunset. It's perfect. Taehyung turned to look at her, his eyes full of tenderness. It is perfect, he agreed. Reaching out to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear. And you are making it even more. Ryan felt her heart flutter at his words, her gaze meeting his as they shared a moment of quiet understanding. Is today a special day? He asked, making her furrow eyebrows before letting out a chuckle. Why? She asked. I'm not sure, but it feels like my birthday, or like I won the lottery, he stated, smiling happily looking at the sunset. You're that happy? Ryan chuckled. Yeah, I wish every day was like today. Think about it. You asked me out on a date. And we spent the day together without my mom and dad nagging me or calling again and again to ask me where I was. He spoke and Ryan smiled looking at him. You're right. Ryan felt a rush of warmth spread through her as she When they finally pulled away, their foreheads resting against each other, Ryan felt a sense of peace settle over her. Taehyung's eyes were filled with love and adoration as he looked up at her, his hand reaching up to cup her cheeks. He whispered, his voice barely above a whisper but filled with sincerity. Ryan felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes as she met his gaze, her heart overflowing with emotion. She replied, her voice catching in her throat. They sat there in silence for a few moments, the sound only being of the gentle lapping of the waves against the shore. And as they watched the stars begin to twinkle in the darkening sky, Ryan knew that this moment would etch in her heart forever. Ryan stood outside Mrs. Kim's office, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that this meeting would change everything. that she was about to make a decision that would alter the course of her and Taehyung's life forever. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door and stepped inside. Mrs. Kim was sitting behind her, a cold expression on her face as she looked up at Ryan. Soon she smirked. Well, look who's here. Seems like you made a decision, she asked, her voice sharp and cocky. Ryan nodded, her hands trembling slightly. Yes, I have, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I can't let my father lose his job. Mrs. Kim's lips curled into a cruel smile. And what do I get in return? Ryan looked away, her jaw clenched. I'll leave. Mrs. Kim raised one of her eyebrows. I'll leave Taehyung and move to another place where he can never find me. She spoke, her heart breaking with each word. I knew you would come to your senses eventually, Mrs. Kim said, satisfaction evident in her tone. You were never worthy of my son anyway. Van felt a surge of anger rise up inside her, but she pushed it down. She couldn't afford to lose her composure now. Taking a deep breath, she met Mrs. Kim's gaze head on. She said, her voice steady. But I can't stand by and watch my father suffer because of me. Mrs. Kim scoffed. Love? What do you know about love? You're just a poor girl who latched onto my son because of his money. Ryan felt tears breaking at the corner of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had to be strong for her father's sake. I may not have money, but I have integrity and loyalty, she said, her voice filled with conviction. I won't sacrifice my father's livelihood for a relationship. Mrs. Kim's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Ryan thought she saw a flicker of something resembling respect in them. but it was quickly replaced by disdain. Fine, Mrs. Kim said coldly. You have made your choice. Now get out of my sight and never come near my son again. Anne nodded, her heart heavy as she turned to leave the office. She could feel Mrs. Kim's eyes boring into her back as she walked away. Each step feeling like dagger in her chest, she suddenly stopped and turned back to look at Mrs. Kim. You're the worst person I've ever met, Mrs. Kim, she said before turning around and leaving her office. As she stepped out into the hallway, Ryan leaned against the wall, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She felt heartbreak coursing through her veins, but she made the right choice. It came at a steep price. The night was cool and quiet as Ryan and Taehyung walked hand in hand down the streets. Ryan could feel the weight of what she was about to say pressing down her chest, making it hard to breathe. Finally, unable to keep it in any longer, she stopped in her tracks, causing Taehyung to turn and look at her with concern. Taehyung, there's something I need to tell you, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Taehyung furrowed his brows, his grip on her hand tightening. What is it, Ryan? He said, smiling softly. Ryan took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was about to come. I'm leaving Taehyung, she said, her voice breaking slightly as the words left her lips. What? He asked, confused. Today was our last date. Ryan smiled sadly, looking away. Taehyung's eyes widened in shock, his grip on her hand losing as she took a step back. Last date? Leaving? What do you mean, Ryan? Where are you going? He asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Tears welled up in Ryan's eyes as she met his gaze, the pain of what she was about to do written all over her face. I'm moving away, Taehyung. I have to go, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Taehyung shook his head, denial written all over his features. No, you can't leave. You can't just walk out of my life like that. Stop joking. This isn't funny, he pleaded, his voice desperate. Wyan felt her heart breaking at the look on his face, but she knew she had to go through this. I'm not joking, Tae. I have to go. It's something I have to do for myself, she said, her voice filled with sorrow. What's the reason? Is it my mother again? He asked, holding her hand. I've made up my mind. I'm going to wipe you out of my life, she said. Taehyung was cut off by her. Thank you for everything, Kim Taehyung. At this point, Taehyung was starting to get mad. You said you loved me, Wyan. Then why? What is wrong with you? It's my mother again, isn't it? No, Wyan shook her head before speaking again. This is my own problem. I've realized something. You and I live in different worlds. Wyan smiled sadly. Us meeting was like a dream to me. But now, it's time to return to our own worlds. Taehyung, who just stared at her, spoke softly. You're lying to me. Just tell me the truth and I'll take care of it. I'll protect you. Wan just looked at Taehyung silently and without another word, she turned and walked away, each step heavier than the last, as she made her way to the bus stop. Taehyung stood rooted to her spot, watching her retreating figure with a sense of helplessness washing over him. Ryan boarded the bus and took a seat by window, tears streaming down her face. She felt a pang of regret and longing for the life she was leaving behind. The bus started moving, slowly pulling away from the curve and heading towards its destination. But as the bus began to pick up speed, Taehyung came running towards it. His breath coming in ragged gasps, and he tried to catch up. Why and wait, please don't go, he shouted, his voice filled with desperation. Ryan's heart clenched at the sound of his voice. She knew she couldn't turn back now. She watched helplessly as Taehyung ran after the bus, his hand outstretched towards her, his eyes pleading for her to stay. But no matter how fast he ran, he couldn't keep up with the speed of bus. And as it gained speed and disappeared into the night, Vine felt a sense of finality settle over her. She was leaving Taehyung behind, and there was nothing she could do to change that now. As the bus carried her further and further away from him, Vine buried her face in her hands, tears flowing freely as she mourned the loss of what could have been. And as the city lights blurred past outside the window, she knew that a piece of her heart would always belong to Taehyung, no matter how far apart they were. Meanwhile, Taehyung stood on the empty street, his chest heaving with exertion and his eyes fixed on the disappearing bus. A sense of numbness washed over him as he realized that Ryan was truly gone, leaving him alone in the darkness. He fell onto his knees, tears flowing from his eyes. Ryan wiped away her tears, a thought in her mind. I wish you were just a normal guy.